When it comes to Algorand, there's been a new listing. I'm not joking. Recently, they announced how it's now live, basically, on something called UEX US. Now, I'll talk about this in today's video. However, I first want to clarify, nothing I say is financial advice, and I'm not telling anyone to do anything. And please excuse my voice, I'm not feeling too good today in terms of, I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, but I'm getting a little bit better. However, yeah, besides that point, let's take a look at Algorand being listed on an exchange, arguably, I would say, when it comes to the case of UEX. Now, people like to say, well, what's UEX? Like, no one's really heard about that. And I get that to a certain extent, because I didn't even know what it is, or what it was, I should say, before I even saw this news. But apparently, UEX, it is registered in the state of Wyoming. So this is pretty impressive. And people like to say, well, okay, who cares about this? But it's the small steps that count. Let's take a look at in the past, right? Projects like in the case of Ethereum, Solana, and even memes like Dogecoin, Shiba Inu, and all this. The fact that they were listed in the exchanges that they were listed on, especially back in 2020 and 2021, really helped it eventually once the market really took off. I mean, granted, they could have still been pretty okay nonetheless because the community was very passionate, but at the same time, exchange listings did matter. It didn't matter if it was a big exchange, a medium-sized one, or let's say an exchange that wasn't that popular. Each played a role a little bit to a certain extent. So people like to say, well, UEX, who cares about Algorand being listed on there? There's so many other places. Totally aware of that. But sometimes the small steps do lead somewhere. That's the thing. Not every listing has to be the best of all time. That's typically not how it works. It's like, for instance, Justin Bieber, when he makes songs. Sometimes they're good, but sometimes, it's all right, I guess. It's not always going to be like, I guess, number one on the billboards every single time, I'm assuming. So it's no different here. It's like, for instance, when we play, baseball, the batting average, is it going to be like 1,000? Probably not, right? So when I take a look at in the case of this space and, new listings, this doesn't disappoint me at all. If anything, I think it's a pretty good victory when it comes to Algorand. Granted, Algorand hasn't been doing the best as of right now. It's still below 10 cents. Now it's almost at 9 cents, but it's actually more so closer to 8.5 cents, which may seem a little bit embarrassing. Some people like to tell me that. And I could understand why that is the hypothetical case, just because people are saying that something like Algorand, literally one of the most popular layer 1 blockchains out there in the world, but it can't really do anything. What is this all about? But we have to consider this situation is not only unique to just Algorand. In fact, if we take a look at it, Algorand back in January of last year, so we're not even talking about that long ago, but besides that point, at that point in January, again of last year in 2025, it was at around 46 cents. We're around 5 times lower than that. Wow. The thing is this, I get it if people like to tell me that, oh, if it goes back there, who really cares? But I think if that reversal were to happen, especially back to around 45 cents, around 46 cents basically, I'm already going to Sizzler. I'm already going to Olive Garden, Applebee's, Red Lobster. I'm already doing all that. Just because it already feels a little bit like a hypothetical celebration to me. People like to say, well, who cares about that movement? Well, Bitcoin's not, 5 times lower than January of last year. I'm just saying, approximately. But yeah, besides that, if I take a look at it as well, we have to consider that Algorand recently had a partnership with something called Zebic. Zebic is a project that's focused on global trade and finance. It has an aspect of Solana, and it has partners like, let's say in the case of Ripple and Stellar. So let's just let that sink in for a bit. Zebic, the partnership happened with Algorand not that long ago. It wasn't too recent, but it happened not too long ago. And I think it was pretty legendary nonetheless. And I think it was a meeting of projects with very different fundamentals, arguably. But then they still collaborated, or had a partnership, I should say, nonetheless. But I could still see why they're a little bit similar. Like Algorand has an aspect of ISO 20022, and so does Zebic. And this actually brings me to my next topic as to how oftentimes people don't consider Algorand as this project to have an aspect of ISO 20022. But it actually does, though. People sometimes don't consider that. And I think sometimes people like to diminish this, which I find very bizarre because if we take a look at, let's say, in the case of Stellar, in the case of Ripple, in the case of XDC, when they have an aspect of ISO 20022, it's often really praised. People often think it's really fantastic. But when it comes to Algorand, suddenly the script flips, and then suddenly people don't care about it. I just don't get it. I think that if we just consider that an aspect of ISO 20022 is amazing regardless, that means it almost doesn't really matter, right? Whether or not I see it in Algorand or Stellar or Ripple or whatever, it almost doesn't really matter at that point because the core principle stays the same. I still think that ISO 20022, a project having an aspect of that, is still pretty impressive. So I view it no different here. And I think if anything, it kind of showcases that Algorand is not just this boring layer 1 blockchain. It's actually a place where, you know what, maybe it could have a use case for global trade and finance, or maybe in the case of AI, because we do know that Algorand supposedly is carbon neutral. And one thing we also do know, though, is that supposedly, in some instances, AI does use a lot of energy. So in a sense where if we take a look at Algorand not using that much energy to begin with, wouldn't this be a location that sometimes developers might consider when they want to build their next AI project? Again, I'm just saying, hypothetically, why not? Especially if we consider the low energy consumption that Algorand has to begin with. Let's not forget as well, if we take a look at Algorand, people sometimes like to tell me, well, this can't really compete anymore. It had its time in 2021, but it can't really do anything now. But that's where I kind of disagree. The reason why is because, yes, there's been more competition ever since 2021, but there hasn't really been too many good ones. I mean, there's a lot in terms of the quantity, but in terms of the quality, not too many, in my opinion. If we take a look at the core group of layer 1 blockchains that existed back in 2021 and were actually very popular, they're kind of more or less the same as of right now. Granted, some of them kind of just, became irrelevant, and also some of them emerged, but the core group of layer 1 blockchains that a lot of people knew, that a lot of people thought were pretty popular back in 2021, more or less that same group is still here today, and they're still pretty massive, and Algorand is one of them. Take a look at Algorand, VeChain, Avalanche, Ethereum, Solana, and all this. They're still around as of right now, and they're still doing pretty okay in terms of popularity. The space isn't doing the best, but that's not a situation that is unique to Algorand. It's not a situation that's unique to just one project as of right now. Now, if the whole space was partying, if it was popping off, basically, and then suddenly Algorand is there just not doing much, okay, then that's very alarming, that's very concerning, but that's not the case, right? Algorand is not doing the best, but also a lot of other projects aren't either. But one thing I do know as well is that I don't really mind the dip, though. That's the thing. I don't mind the dip. That's just my mindset. However, I'm not telling anyone to do anything. I'm only hypothetically dollar cost averaging around once a month anyway, so I'm treating this like a marathon. It's not like a sprint to me. I'm not thinking about, what's going to happen in the next 24 hours or 48 hours. I'm not a trader. What I'm doing is I'm just holding and waiting. That's really about it. But nonetheless, I think it's pretty awesome that Algorand got listed on a new exchange, arguably, I would say. Especially at a time like this, where the market isn't doing the best, but then we still see something like that happen. Wow, I think it's pretty impressive, and I think it's a big 2 thumbs up for me. However, I'm not telling anyone to do anything, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one. It's Willie the Captain. I want to say thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a very amazing day.